SECfans.com. Week 6 is here. Going to talk Texas A&M, Kentucky, and we're going to talk a few more games this week than we normally do. We had a little success last week sort of getting the model out for Georgia, Tennessee, not having a huge protracted discussion, but at least letting you see the numbers and see what the model thinks and what we think. And that gives us a little more coverage around the SEC, even for some not-so-big games. Texas A&M fans, you've been with us for a while. You know the drill. If you like what we're doing, give us a like. If you love it, give us a subscribe. And Kentucky fans, you heard from us for the first time last week this season. Half of this show, Josh, picked you to win, and the other half, me, did not. Although I will say in my defense, I'm married to a Carolina grad. She would not have loved me picking Kentucky to win over her Gamecocks. Should have gone with my gut. Kentucky fans, hang out with us maybe one more week. Let us know if you like us, if you love us, if you hate us. Even if you don't subscribe, give us a comment down below. Let us know how crazy we are and give us your score prediction. And mix it up in the comments. We'll mix it up with you too. All right. If you looked at this game in August, Josh, and you saw Texas A&M and Kentucky, A&M fans would probably think, okay, we're probably going to be struggling a little bit first year under Jimbo. This is not a rebuilding year, but we don't have super high expectations. But this is a win that we can count on to sort of solidify our season and get going in a good direction. And Kentucky fans, maybe they knew they were going to be this good for this long into the season. But either way, I don't think we would have thought that this game would have this much gravity to it. And gosh, it really feels like it does, and that's why we're kicking it off with Week 6 being kind of our game of the week. It's really interesting. I know Kentucky fans are playing the we got haters, we got doubters card, and so far I think everybody has kept waiting for Kentucky to stub their toe. And coming in, A&M's got a game where they didn't look so great against Arkansas. So Josh, tell me right now, outside of your pick, do you think Kentucky overall is maybe the favorite in this game?
I think so. And, slight spoilers, but I mean, the model agrees with it as well. The weird thing with Kentucky this year is I think it's a combination of a couple things. In the past, Kentucky sort of struggled because they have had a hard time staying with other teams at the line of scrimmage at times. Part of the issue this year, and we've talked about this quite a bit on the show, is the impact that Kentucky has had at quarterback and having Terry Wilson in and just having the ability to make some plays in the passing game to keep other teams honest. Benny Snell is the focal point, as he should be. It's probably the best part of that offense. But in the past, teams, if you could shut down Benny Snell, you could be extremely successful. This year, that hasn't really been the case. And looking at, just like if you look at the box score from the South Carolina game, I'm going to kind of jump ahead a little bit, but there's two things that stand out to me in that game. The first is one, and you may want to touch on this in a minute. Kentucky did not statistically beat South Carolina that badly anywhere except for the turnover column. That game was actually pretty evenly matched in a lot of ways statistically. But the thing that sort of sticks out to me and why Kentucky is able to win these games, despite the fact that maybe they aren't being ridiculously successful, it's the fact that Benny Snell gets held to 3.5 yards a carry, under 100 yards on this day with 28 carries, and Kentucky's still able to move the ball because Kentucky has a quarterback in Terry Wilson that's actually functional. And in past years, if you could hold Kentucky's running game in check, really, I think their whole offense tanked. So, I mean, I definitely think my biggest takeaway from this, bar none, is Kentucky, is a much better team than they were last year. Getting on the lineman back is a big deal. The defensive line looks a lot better. We'll talk about that when we get to the model and the impact that's having. But the biggest thing is the fact that they can have a game where the running back has 3.5 yards per carry, and they're still able to put up 24 points because they have enough of a passing game to keep the ball moving. And even with 130 yards in the air, it's enough to keep drives sustained and be able to score.
All right, so I don't want you to give me your score yet, and we're not doing the model yet, but I would like for you to go ahead and tell me, because it sort of drives the rest of this discussion. Do you have Kentucky or A&M winning this game?
Personally, at the moment, I probably have A&M winning it, but yeah, it's a close pick.
Okay, so you saying it's a close pick, and for people who haven't been following our channel this year, both of us have said We think A&M might be the second best team in the West this year when it's all said and done. And LSU may have changed that a little bit with how well they did against Ole Miss and all that. But with you saying it's a close pick, how much of it, true or false, is a lot of that based on the fact that A&M really struggled with Arkansas?
A lot of it is.
Okay, so follow up. Do you buy into, because this is what Bama fans are going to tell you. Bama fans are going to say, that wasn't the real A&M. The real A&M's pretty good. They just had a Bama hangover. Do you buy into that at all?
Maybe to a small degree. There's a lot of statistics out there, and it's been a while since we ran the numbers, but the loss rate for teams following playing Alabama or LSU, LSU's fallen off a little bit in recent years, but for quite a while, anybody that played Alabama or LSU lost the following week, or at least never actually met the spread. The reason is pretty obvious. You get really beat up. Those two teams are really physical in a way that most teams in the conference aren't. I don't buy that, and this is probably something we'll get into more in the Alabama Arkansas preview. But it's notable in Texas A&M's case. I think the biggest thing for Texas A&M is they're still definitely a team that's more predicated on the run than the pass. They have a good passing game, surprisingly good. But this was 2 years ago, an almost totally rush offense that's slowly transitioning back into a passing game. Trevor Knight going to Kellen Mond. Arkansas has actually got a pretty darn good rush defense. I mean, Arkansas has not allowed any team to have 4 yards per carry. Auburn only had 2.5 yards per carry against Arkansas, so it's easy for A&M fans to sit there and feel like the offense was struggling at 3.8 yards per carry. There's a lot of indications that Arkansas's run defense, as bad a team as Arkansas is actually quite good. And now Kentucky's going to be sort of a similar test, but I think there's maybe a little overreaction to how bad Arkansas is. A little bit of it's a hangover. And the other thing I'll kind of get into there with Arkansas and Texas A&M is the opposite of what I would say, which is also pretty interesting to me between South Carolina and Kentucky. Whereas I noted South Carolina and Kentucky, statistically, that was a close game. Kentucky outgained South Carolina by 6 yards, 327 to 321. A&M Arkansas was not a close game statistically. A&M outgained Arkansas 377 to 248. I know at one point late in the third quarter I looked at it and A&M was actually outgaining. I think it was in the fourth quarter. A&M was outgaining Arkansas 2-1, and it was like a 3-point game. So it there's a little bit of a hangover there, sure, but the short answer is I really think more than anything, Texas A&M really just ran into a team that was well geared to stop them, and Texas A&M had one of those games where you actually have decent production in a lot of ways. 7.7 yards per attempt is pretty darn good, and then you just don't actually generate any points.
It's interesting to me, not just the run defense from Arkansas, and if their run defense is for real, then that's a good sign because, yes, Mond was slowed a little bit or a lot. I mean, he didn't run the ball at all. But Trevion Williams, 152 yards, 5.2 yards per carry, which is a big bounce back for Bama. Arkansas has actually faced a lot of good quarterbacks this year. Jarrett Stidham, Kellen Mond, Carter Samuels at Colorado State, who you've been high on for over a year now, and Mason Fine in North Texas. That kid is balling this year. 2 400-yard games, a 300-yard game against La Tech, almost a 300-yard game against Arkansas. Is it possible that maybe we're overweighting the Arkansas loss and saying this is the loss to North Texas, saying this is a terrible team, this is a bottom 20 type team, and A&M should have beat them by 50, but in reality, Arkansas has a sneaky good defense enough to keep them in the game, kind of like Kentucky's defense is actually really good, and there's some evidence to show that it's not just bad offenses they're facing. Is it possible that Arkansas is better than we think, which means A&M maybe didn't have to destroy them to still be a good football team?
I think it's probably entirely possible. You mentioned North Texas, and again, I don't want to drone on too much because we'll probably do a short video on Alabama, Arkansas. But um, Arkansas played a quarterback, in Story that hadn't had a ton of reps off and on. It seemed like at times he was somewhat effective in moving the ball. And definitely think there's an overreaction to Arkansas's defense because I think they actually are pretty solid. And like you said, North Texas, they lost a lot of Tech, but lost 29-27. They still moved the ball pretty well, and they've blown out everybody else they played. I will give you sort of the other side to it, and it's something the models noted and something that shouldn't surprise Texas A&M fans. The bigger concern with that game is the fact that Arkansas threw for 7 yards per attempt, and it's the fact that A&M is giving up 120% of opponent passing averages on the season. So I was less concerned with 24 points by A&M than I was in some ways 17 from Arkansas. And pass defense it already was a concern for Texas A&M, and I think most fans were there. And this is just continuing to show that that's probably going to be a problem throughout the entirety of the season.
All right. So if we're going on the other side and looking at Kentucky, and we're making still a little bit of a case for A&M. Kentucky fans, don't get mad. We're negative with everybody. We show you love too. We're going to show you love in a minute with the model. Still love you. Got to be negative for a minute. Got to pick you apart. Okay, so except for South Carolina, who still didn't have huge production day against Georgia, which was really close, all the other teams that Kentucky has played this year have had poorer offensive scoring production outings against other teams they played, which might speak to the fact that Kentucky could have a good defense, could be playing terrible offenses, could be a little bit of both.
I think there's probably some merit to the fact that a lot of the teams they've played, maybe are not as good as we think. And it's kind of interesting to me because the teams are so closely related. You have Florida and Mississippi State that both played each other. We know Florida beat Mississippi State close, but in a game that was 13-6. So neither one of those offenses was in any way effective against the other team. You've got to give Kentucky credit for scoring 28 and 27 against both of them. But at the same time, it's also kind of interesting that Florida scored more points against Kentucky than they did against Mississippi State. Mississippi State scored more points against Kentucky than they did against Florida. So I think, to a certain extent, the defense may be a little bit overestimated. I think they're still quite good. The model backs that up. I don't think they're impenetrable by any means, but I think the biggest thing when you look down the slate to me, and I don't know if you agree with it, it's the quarterbacks. Felipe Franks, I thought under Dan Mullen might take a little bit of a step forward. I started the season saying Florida was probably my number 2, added South Carolina in the East. Right now, it's pretty clearly in my mind, it's Kentucky that's number 2. And it was kind of funny because when Kentucky beat Florida, all the South Carolina fans were crowing to us on our channel about how stupid we were, how stupid I was for picking Florida number 2. The truth of the matter is Florida still is probably better than South Carolina. It's just that everybody underestimated Kentucky and assumed Florida was terrible because Florida lost a very close game to Kentucky, where Florida had a chance to win right at the end of the game. But regardless, Felipe Franks has looked lost most of the time. And sometimes you see those skills there and you can see the talent, but his ability to read and react on the football field and act with any sort of consistency mentally or physically is low. And then if you kept stepping through the slate, South Carolina, we have long been critical of Jake Bentley as a very inconsistent passer and a guy that when you watch his highlight reels looks fantastic because he can make some huge plays, but he's also the kind of guy that throws 3 interceptions in a ball game. And that's the thing that's killed or hurt South Carolina is they don't ever sustain drives and they throw away tremendous number of points because of how inconsistent they are with Jake Bentley at the helm. And then there's also Mississippi State, which has a similar problem in that we both were really wondering after the first few games when they were able to just run the ball for 10 yards a carry, how it was going to work when they had to throw it because Fitzgerald was not in any way consistent throwing the football early in the season, even in blowouts. And that seemed like that was going to have to catch up to him.
Okay, so and this is where we get into the model because I think the model will show us this, but I haven't seen the model yet. So before you show us the model, I want you to tell me what you think. The flip side of this, if we're putting something in Kentucky's favor in this game, and a reason why they might win in this game, is something that might look bad on paper on the surface because you mentioned that they didn't score in the second half. They scored 24 points. But you also mentioned that A&M outgained Arkansas 2-1 and still only led by 3 points. Is there a scoring efficiency opportunity here for Kentucky where they may not need a ton of yards per carry or yards per attempt from their quarterback to actually put points on the board, where A&M is going to have to put up gobs of yards to match their scoring production relative to at least what they've done so far? And I ask that because, Kentucky put up 24 points in this game against South Carolina. They did not have a great performance from Benny Snell Jr. Yes, he had 99 yards, but it's 3.5 yards per carry. Terry Wilson, 6.6 yards per attempt. Not great, but they managed, sometimes you see these, 24 points with bad statistics, and you're like, okay, well, there was a kickoff return, or there was, interception return, something like that. They had 75-yard drive, 80-yard drive, 61-yard drive for their 3 touchdowns. So, is there something there that maybe Kentucky, in your mind, and then show us the model? Maybe Kentucky's scoring efficiency outweighs the fact that they don't put up the best pure statistical numbers.
I think there's probably something to be said to that. It's kind of odd because Texas A&M leaves. In one hand, they can have very effective drives, and on the other hand, they leave it a lot of stuff on the table. And we've talked about this a lot. When you have an offense that tends to move the ball in chunks, you can score really quickly, and you can also. Some people gave us some grief on our comment section about turning yards into points, and what we mean by that is if you got a team that moves the ball in chunks, you get this big play, and then you end up punting, and then big play, and then you end up punting. Um, when you do that, the yardage that you generate, you don't get any credit for yardage in football. You get credit for touchdowns. And from a predictive aspect, we want to look at your yardage as something of a predictor for points. And then from a practical aspect, if you're gaining yards in a football team, you'd like to have something to show for it on the scoreboard. And offenses kind of get off and on with that. Though I will say this. It's kind of interesting. Kentucky and Texas A&M both scored 24 points last week. A&M had 377 yards. Kentucky had 327 yards. So A&M may have had slightly more, but also A&M had 2 turnovers to only 1 of Kentucky. Kind of indicates, a little bit of what you're saying. There's a little bit of an advantage with A&M. I think the turnovers are probably not an unexpected thing with the offense and the way they run it. They take a lot of risks with Mond. But I'm going to go ahead and jump on the model here. When you look at the model and you look at the teams, the way these two teams play out, it's pretty straightforward. Both these rush defenses are very, very good. That's definitely the strength of both teams. Texas A&M's rush defense, 68% of opponent average. Kentucky, 67%. They're pretty much evenly matched in that regard. I don't expect either team to have much success on the ground. The model bears that out. A&M is only expected to have 3 yards per carry. Kentucky is only expected to have 4 yards per carry. It's easy to say 4 yards per carry is a pretty good stat, but if you were to look over the course of the season, Kentucky has not been held to 4 yards per carry in any game. 4.78 against South Carolina was the lowest they had. So this is supposed to be by far the hardest day they have on the ground so far. And that's going to hold both teams probably to a lower point total. But the trick is, and this is what I started with at the beginning of the show, it's pass defense. Texas A&M is giving up 120% of opponent passing averages. Texas A&M is giving up 9.8 yards per attempt. 9.8 yards per attempt. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. That's bad. And if like nationally, 9.8 puts Texas A&M in FBS competition, mind you. So we're throwing out. We don't really. Every time we give a stat, it's usually not considering FCS teams. That's 117th nationally in yards per attempt. So 117 out of 130. I think that's a pretty rough number for Texas A&M. I get they played some really good teams, but again, even accounting for that, which our model does, they're still giving up 120% of averages. Kentucky is much better, 84% against the pass, or 83, depending on how you want to round it. That's a really good number. Anything really under 85 is very good. It's hard to keep teams below their passing average. But again, another caveat, A&M's faced opponents that average 8.2 yards per attempt. Kentucky's opponents only average 6.4. We've talked about a lot on the show that you really need 6.5 yards per attempt to be a competent passing team. Kentucky's average opponent is not a competent passing team. And there's something to be said that you can maybe do a little better against the pass when nobody is really effective. And when you play teams that aren't really great passing the ball and you're able to shut down the run, a lot of times their passing game just folds. But regardless, what it really comes down to is A&M can't run it, neither can Kentucky. But Kentucky gets about a half yard per play advantage passing the ball. But by the same token, Kentucky is way more run heavy than A&M is. So Kentucky is supposed to be getting about 5.3 yards per play. A&M 4.6. Neither one of those are great numbers. They're just They're competent numbers, not much more. But Kentucky is more efficient off their production. So with a half yard advantage in yards per play and an advantage in scoring efficiency, the model has Kentucky 28, Texas A&M 19.
That number doesn't really shock me, based on really. I think that the model is still a little bit jaundiced to the pure numbers, and it's influenced by the fact that A&M has played two excellent defenses, one ultra elite offense, where Kentucky has played I think they played some decent teams. I don't know that they played a really good offense yet. And I maintain that A&M is the second best offense in the West, possibly the second best offense in the SEC. I'm pretty high on Trevion Williams. I think he's going to struggle here, but I think Kellen Mond is a quarterback in a style and quality that Kentucky hasn't faced yet. I got bit in the ass last week going against Kentucky. I'm going to do it again this week, and I'm going to do it reasonably big. Although I don't think A&M is built to really blow teams out, so I don't think they're going to blow out Kentucky, even if they could. 31-20 A&M. I think Kellen Mond gets his legs back in this game, kind of like he had against Alabama. Look, they scored 16 legit points against Alabama. They scored 26, should have been 40 legit points against Clemson's defense. There's no way in the world, in my mind, they only scored 19 against Kentucky. If they do, man, I would love to eat those words, because that means we're seeing a Kentucky team that we haven't seen in a really long time, and I think that's really cool and really exciting. But for this week, give me 31-20 Texas A&M. Tell me what you think.
I generally am around the same sort of vein of thinking as you. And, you mentioned the start that you possibly due to the influence of your wife and fear was probably a factor there, picked against Kentucky. But I had Kentucky last week 31-17, which was not, not far off at all from the actual reality of that. 27-17, which wasn't far off from the reality of that game. I was thinking of the Notre Dame game. But anyway, I'm high on Kentucky. I like Kentucky. I think Kentucky's a very good team. I think Kentucky's a good run defense. I think Kentucky's front is the thing that's keeping them in games. I think they have ended up having one of the best D lines in the SEC, and certainly one of the best in the East, where things are a lot more shaky. Even Georgia in that Tennessee game didn't look phenomenal at times. But, and this is a big but, I don't think Kentucky's played a team that's made them have to play balanced defense yet. And what we've seen from Kentucky at times in the past is that if you get them moving laterally, the lack of high talent recruiting guys starts to show pretty fast. Josh Allen's a phenomenal player, but Josh Allen is going to be a much more phenomenal player when they're containing the run and you're playing guys that aren't extremely mobile in the pocket and he can affect the passer. Jake Bentley is mobile. Felipe Franks is mobile. They are not anywhere close to the mobility of Kellen Mond, who, and we've talked about this a lot, or were shocked after that A&M game a couple weeks ago, right, that Kellen Mond outran one of the Alabama corners on a long run. He's a freak. And when you can do that, it changes the way you have to play a team. It makes it a lot harder for your defensive ends in particular to impact the game at times, because the guy can outrun them. It also makes him hard to spy. And this is sort of the stat I'm going to draw off of here. If you looked at the leading tacklers for Kentucky, it's West, Daniel, Allen, Jones, and Edwards. That's 3 linebackers and 2 safeties. Not particularly surprising, but what I think is interesting is just how few tackles really there are once you get down to to the defensive backs. Your starting corners for Kentucky, they don't have tackles, and you got to get all the way. You go down from there. You get Beatty 6th on the team in tackles. Robinson's all the way at 10th. They're not facing many passes on the corners, and what they have been facing, it's pretty clear. The linebackers and safeties have been able to chase it down. They're going to be challenged in a way they absolutely haven't been challenged to this point. They've had the luxury of basically been able to play run first, stack the box a little bit, and every game they've played, they're not going to be able to do that. That's going to make the linebackers play in space to a degree that they have not been asked to do And I'm not sure they have the athleticism to do it. And then to leverage off what you said before, I'm also very high on Texas A&M. I've been high, I feel like, every year for the past few years on them in the first half of the season. They've let me down. I'm curious to see if they can avoid that trend this year with Fisher. But I certainly agree with you that it seems a little odd to say A&M would score about the same as they did against Alabama and significantly less than they did against Clemson, who are both very, very, very good defenses. So I agree with you. I think the Kentucky score of 28 by the model is probably not that far off. I just think the model is really underselling A&M in this case based off overestimating Kentucky due to the fact that Kentucky's been able to make people up to this point more one-dimensional than they should. I'm going to take Texas A&M 31, Kentucky 28. And I still think it's a close game, but I have Texas A&M with a slight edge.
True or false? If A&M loses this game, it will be because they give up a lot of yardage and scores through the air and still stifle Benny Snell Jr.
I would agree with that. And can I give a caveat when you say stifle him? I even could see Benny Snell Jr. having some success in the passing game because A&M's linebackers have at times been a little susceptible, and the safeties have been if they can get him isolated. But I'm not sure their offense is great at doing that. But I don't think they're going to have much success with design power runs on A&M's front from what we've seen from them to this point this year.
A&M has, for me, what I've seen this year, and this is what I said. I said A&M's going to drop a game this year. They shouldn't. They've got enough talent to go 10-2. They have the biggest disparity between elite front four and garbage back four. And not so much even the corners, but the safeties are so bad. But the secondary in general is so bad. And the front four, especially in run defense, is so good. I don't recall a time that I've seen such a disparity.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Dalen Mack was, one of the most recruited players in the country on the D line, and we're seeing some of those guys start to develop and win battles. And in the back end, we talked about before the season, we were curious because I thought Armani Watts was the standout player in the secondary, and honestly, I didn't think Armani Watts was that good. I just felt like it was a bad sign that he stood out that much for Texas A&M in the past. And it sort of said a lot about what the other guys were and what they were going to be without him and the experience they used to have back there. They'll get it shored up, but there's for sure this lays at the feet of someone. It's kind of incredible what Fisher was left with on the back seven because there's clearly just really aren't pieces that they need to be effective in any way in the passing game.
All right, Kentucky fans, A&M fans, let us know what you think the score is going to be. Kentucky fans, I'm probably wrong. I think I've got a losing record at this point this year. We try to keep it pretty honest on this show and call it like we see it, which means sometimes we piss some people off, but it also gives you an opportunity to tell us that you told us so. So tell us so in the comments, and please remember to subscribe. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.